Hi, I'm Dr. John Fitzgerald, and welcome to this lecture series on the Sixth Commandment and Catholic sexual ethics. We'll begin with some foundational concepts, starting with the magisterium and its role. Before we even get to talking about Catholic teaching on morality in particular, we need to talk about how Catholic teaching works in general. For Catholics, the magisterium is the official teaching authority of the Church, consisting of the Pope and bishops. According to Catholics, Peter was the first pope, and the 12 apostles were the first bishops. Catholics believe that the magisterium was formed by Jesus Christ himself when he selected 12 apostles and gave Peter a special role over them, as evidenced in the Bible. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, Jesus calls Peter the rock of his church, gives him the keys of the church, and makes him shepherd of the whole flock. And in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, only Peter is charged with strengthening the brethren so their faith would not falter. When Peter and the apostles passed away, a new pope and bishops were chosen to succeed them all the way down to the present day. The current pope, Pope Francis, is number 266, according to the official count. Catholics believe that Jesus set up such a magisterium, in the words of the late Jesuit theologian Avery Cardinal Dulles, in order to provide a reliable means for the preservation and transmission of God's revealed truths throughout the centuries. Otherwise, the idea is, we would just be left up to our own devices in interpreting the Bible and Christian tradition on the many issues on which they are silent or ambiguous, and so there would be widespread disagreement among Christians, and ultimately no sure way of knowing what God's will really is. In fact, there are tens of thousands of different Christian denominations or branches in the world today. Catholics, and indeed many other Christians, would say such widespread division was not part of God's original plan. In order to ensure that it would accurately transmit His will, Catholics say that God gave the magisterium the special gift of infallibility. In order to understand what this gift is, we have to understand what it is not. Is the Pope morally perfect? No, of course not. There have been several bad popes throughout history who were corrupt and even had illegitimate children. But even the last few, who seem pretty holy, go to confession quite often. Nobody's perfect. If the Pope tells his dinner guests that the Yankees are going to win the World Series next year, do Catholics think he is infallible? No, of course not. And having grown up a Red Sox fan, I hope not. So those are some obvious examples of what infallibility does not mean. What it does mean is that when the Pope and the bishops manifest universal agreement on a matter of faith and morals, at any time in history, they can teach without the possibility of error. The Pope teaches infallibly when he declares that his teaching is ex cathedra, literally, from the throne. That is, he teaches as supreme pastor of the Church. However, according to traditional Catholic theology, even when the Pope does not speak ex cathedra, if his teaching is sufficiently formal, frequent, and emphatic, the faithful still owe it religious submission of mind and will. Finally, infallibility can work not just via a top-down approach, but also via a bottom-up approach. In other words, the sense of the faithful can also be infallible when they manifest practically universal agreement on a particular issue. However, according to traditional Catholic thought, only members of the Church who, 1, let their views be formed more by the gospel than by general society or culture, for instance, reality TV shows, and 2, agree with the Pope and bishops. In other words, it's not a matter of lay people outvoting bishops. Only they count as the faithful. One way the Pope can exercise his teaching authority is by releasing papal encyclicals. Now that's just a fancy word for a very long letter addressed to the faithful, and often to all people of goodwill. We'll be looking at some of those encyclicals in this series of videos. Our next foundational concept is happiness, the meaning of life, and morality. We'll begin with Veritatis Splendor and the story of the rich young man. Now on to another fundamental concern to help us segue specifically into morality, How do we achieve happiness and meaning in life? This is a pressing question for just about all of us at one point or another. According to the 2016 World Happiness Report, published by an arm of the United Nations and based upon recent Gallup World Poll data, respondents averaged only a 5.35 when asked to rate the quality of their lives on a scale of 0 to 10. And closer to home, a 2016 Harris poll determined that just 31% of Americans were very happy. The Christian answer to this question can be found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. Here, a rich young man, who isn't given a personal name, asks Jesus, "Teacher, what good must I do to have eternal life?" Jesus tells him to follow the commandments, including, but not limited to the one that will be particularly important for our purposes, "You shall not commit adultery." The rich young man responds, "All of these I have observed. What do I still lack?" Jesus responds, "If you wish to be perfect, go, sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." The rich young man is unable to bring himself to relinquish his many possessions, and so he goes away sad. Jesus then tells his followers, who have overheard this conversation, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for one who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. They are amazed and ask, "Who then can be saved?" Jesus responds, "For human beings this is impossible, but for God all things are possible." St. John Paul II wrote at length on this passage in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, which is Latin for the splendor of truth. Here he claims that the rich young man's question is also one about the meaning of life. The moral of the story here is that acting ethically helps us achieve the perfect happiness of heaven and the meaning of life, although, in order to do so, we also need the grace of God, as Jesus indicates, as well as the assistance of the magisterium in interpreting the commandments, according to John Paul II. Moreover, the Bible elsewhere suggests that doing good, and in particular following God's law, can also lead to happiness and flourishing in this life. For example, in Deuteronomy, chapters 5 to 6, where Moses gives the Israelites the Ten Commandments. Of course, the idea that morality promotes not just others' interests, but also our own, ought not to be our only motivation for acting ethically, but perhaps it can help attract us to do so. And we'll be seeing a couple of ways in which acting in accord with church teaching can be connected to our own well-being. Now, let's take a look at love and responsibility. According to traditional Catholic thought, there is a connection between sexual morality in particular and happiness too. In 1960, when the future Pope and Saint John Paul II was known as Karol Wojtyła, a bishop in Krakow, Poland, he wrote an entire book on sexual morality called Love and Responsibility. In this book, he claims that following traditional sexual morality is fulfilling rather than burdensome. Speaking of the virtue of chastity, which we'll get to later, he says that it's not one long no, but above all the yes, of which certain no's are the consequence. More specifically, the essence of chastity consists in quickness to affirm the value of the person in every situation, and in raising to the personal level all reactions to the value of the body and sex. As far as particular kinds of acts, the future Pope makes the claim that abortion can have harmful physical and psychological effects, for example, guilt, that artificial means of contraception, specifically chemical means, can be bad for the body, and that premarital sex can have certain bad psychological effects, such as the fear of having a child. The appendix to this book is particularly fascinating. He talks about how within marriage, a husband has the duty to provide pleasure to his wife while lovemaking. In sum, it seems clear that he's trying to present a positive, healthy view of human sexuality. Not so much, God says no, so don't do it, but if you follow God's laws, you will be happy. Many contemporary commentators on love and responsibility have pointed out that if we situate Catholic sexual morality in this light at the outset, then perhaps it becomes a bit easier to accept and abide by. Our third foundational concept is Catholic action theory. We'll begin by looking at 3 elements of the morality of human acts. So now let's look at some basic building blocks of Catholic moral theology. And we'll begin with how we can evaluate the morality of a particular act. There are 3 elements of a human act: object, intention, and circumstances. Basically, the object is what you're doing. The intention is why you're doing it. And the circumstances are those which surround the act. For instance, how much, when, where, and the consequences or effects of the act. Let's take an example I often use with my students. After one of my lectures at school, let's say, Susan drops her bag, and Dave sees this and quickly picks it up for her. What's the object of Dave's act? Simple, picking up the bag. The object is essentially what he's doing. Now, what's the intention? This is trickier. It could be just in order to help Susan out of generosity, although it also could be in order to get a date. Maybe picking up the bag could lead to starting a conversation and then to him getting her email or phone number. Now, what if I add the detail that it is well known that Dave is the president of the Honor Code Society at his school? Then, another possible intention is that he's trying to look good in front of others or to avoid charges of hypocrisy. What are the circumstances? Well, when would be the time of day, where is where she dropped the bag, and how is how Dave picks up the books quickly. Let's take one more example specific to high school or college students doing one's work for a class. What's the object of this act? Easy. Doing your work for class. What's the intention? To get a good grade. Okay. Why would a student want to do that? To graduate. Okay, why want to do that? Well, to get a job. Why? To eat. Why? Okay, I'll stop. The point of that little exercise is that we can have shorter and longer term intentions. You get the idea. What are the circumstances of doing your work, by the way? Well, if you're a student, again, where could be the library, when might be late at night, etc. According to Catholic teaching, an act is morally good only if the object, intention, and circumstances are all good, or at least neutral. In other words, if any one of these 3 elements is bad, then the entire act is morally bad. From the perspective of Catholic teaching, examples of bad objects would include worshiping false gods, murder, adultery, rape, lying, stealing, torture, slavery, prostitution, abortion, and genocide. So even if only the object is bad, for example, you rob a bank to take your family on a nice vacation, the entire act is bad. And even if only the intention is bad, for example, you give money to charity, but only for your own fame and glory, the entire act is bad. And finally, even if only the circumstances are bad. For instance, Dave slowly and carefully picks up all of the spilled contents of Susan's bag in order to help her, but the building is on fire and both of them should be evacuating ASAP instead. Or a married couple has sex because they love each other, good object, good intention, but they are doing so in public, bad circumstance, bad where, the entire act is bad. This rule is rooted in the Bible. For example, Daniel chapter 13, which tells the story of Susanna, a virtuous Hebrew wife whom some elderly men attempt to blackmail by saying they will accuse her of sexual immorality unless she sleeps with them. Susanna refuses to do so, even in order to avoid arrest. And in the New Testament, St. Paul in Romans 3:8 suggests that we should not do evil so that good may come of it. Now, one final thing about circumstances. They contribute to increasing or diminishing the goodness or badness of an act, and a person's responsibility for that act. Let's see some examples. From the perspective of Catholic moral teaching, what's a circumstance that might make being a prostitute less bad? Duress, blackmail, destitution. And what's even better than volunteering for an hour for charity? Well, volunteering for more than that over an extended period of time. as long as you can afford the time commitment, of course. This is similar to how our criminal justice system works, by the way. Premeditated murder is considered worse and punished more than manslaughter, killing in the heat of the moment, which in turn is considered worse and punished more than killing by reason of insanity. Now we'll look at the principle of double effect. The Catholic moral tradition holds that in the case of particular actions with good consequences, or effects, and bad consequences, or effects, we have to apply the principle of double effect. As I see it, this principle is basically a further clarification and elaboration of Catholic action theory, of what it means for an object, intention, and circumstances to be all good. The principle says that in order for an act to be morally good, all of the following 4 criteria must be met. Criteria number 1, the object is not bad. Criteria number 2, you desire the good effect or effects and don't actually desire the bad effects. This criterion helps ensure your intention is actually good. Criterion number 3, the bad effects do not cause the good effects. This criterion also helps ensure your intention is actually good. If the bad effect did cause the good effect, then it would appear that you really did want the bad effect to happen, and therefore your intention is not quite right. Finally, criterion number 4, the good effects are equal to or outweigh the bad ones. This helps ensure the circumstances, which include consequences, overall are good. Let's take a couple of examples. First, a mother applying antiseptic to a child's wound. Are there good effects and bad effects? Well, yes, there's one of each. The antiseptic disinfects the wound, but causes a painful sting. The principle of double effect applies because we have good and bad effects. Is this action morally permissible? Well, let's start with step number 1. What's the object? Disinfecting a wound. Is that bad? No, disinfecting a wound is a good thing. So we've passed step number 1. How about step number 2? Does the mother desire the good effect and not the bad effect? Yes, presumably the mother desires only that the wound be disinfected, not to cause the child pain, assuming we have a normal mom. So we've passed step number 2. What about step number 3? Does the bad effect, the pain, cause the good effect, the disinfection? No, of course not. Applying the antiseptic is what disinfects the wound. So we've passed step number 3. Finally, let's look at step number 4. The good effect here, avoiding any long-term infection, definitely outweighs the bad one, a momentary experience of pain. So we've passed step number 4. In short, we've passed all 4 criteria, so yes, applying antiseptic is morally permissible. Now that's a pretty easy example. You can see that just using common sense. The principle of double effect merely confirms our basic intuition here. Here's a second example. Torturing an enemy spy to gain knowledge. Are there good effects and bad effects? Yes. The good effect is gaining knowledge, but the bad effect is causing extreme pain to the enemy. So the principle of double effect applies. Is this action permissible? Do we pass step number 1? No. The object here, torture, is always bad according to Catholic teaching, as we've already seen. Remember that an action with good and bad effects needs to pass all 4 criteria of the principle of double effect in order to be morally permissible. And so, we don't have to do the other criteria. This action is already not permissible from the perspective of Catholic teaching. We'll do an example with regard to sexual morality later on. Now let's look at virtues and vices. According to Catholic teaching, while individual acts are morally important, so too are the dispositions we cultivate. For instance, Jesus enumerates several beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. For instance, blessed are the poor in spirit, the peacemakers, the pure of heart, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. What Jesus is praising in a way here are virtues, which are basically habits or dispositions to do good. Cardinal virtues, according to Catholic teaching, are key virtues that pertain to inner worldly activities. In other words, actions that concern ourselves or other people. One cardinal virtue that is especially important for our purposes is temperance, which involves having good emotions and good actions that flow from those emotions. Temperance pertains especially to desiring pleasurable activities, such as eating, drinking, and sexual activity, to a reasonable or moderate degree. There's a famous clip from the TV show The Simpsons called Donut Hell, you can find it online, where Homer agrees to sell his soul to the devil if he eats an entire donut, and later ends up eating it anyway. Is Homer temperate here? No. Why not? Well, he's a glutton. He has bad emotions, craves food too much, and bad actions that flow from those emotions. He eats the donut at the expense of his soul. Conversely, if someone eats reasonably and moderately, that person is temperate. Here's another example. Which of the following people would be considered temperate? The person who is a promiscuous sex addict, the person who thinks all sex is dirty and bad, or the person who enjoys sex in a loving relationship with his or her spouse? Only the last person, because only he or she desires pleasurable activities in a reasonable way. The second cardinal virtue is fortitude, also known as courage, which involves facing difficulties well. Third, there is justice, which is the disposition of giving what we owe to God and neighbor. The fourth, and most important, cardinal virtue is prudence, which helps us decide the right thing to do and then to carry it out. The Catholic moral tradition considers prudence the charioteer of the virtues. The idea is that we need to be good at figuring out the right thing to do and then doing it in order to be temperate, courageous, and just. Now, the first half of prudence is deciding the right thing to do. And in order to have that, we need to form our conscience. In other words, to make sure our conscience is working properly. How do Catholics form their conscience? In other words, how do they try to figure out the right action when faced with an ethical dilemma? Well, we can lay out 3 ways. First, we can form our conscience through ourselves. In other words, by reflecting on our own life experience. Maybe we've already faced that ethical dilemma in the past and can learn from how we handled it then. Second, we can form our conscience through others by asking the advice of people who we trust, such as family, friends, or a pastor. Finally, we can form our conscience through God more directly by praying to God for the answer, reading the Bible, say Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as a source of moral insight, and or studying church teachings. For as we've already seen, Catholics believe the job of the magisterium is to reliably interpret God's will. Now, Catholics also believe there are 3 theological virtues, which primarily, but not exclusively, concern our relationship with God. The first is faith, which involves believing in true things about God. Then there is hope, which consists of the desire for heaven. Finally, there is charity, also known as love, which involves loving God above all else and our neighbors as ourselves. Where do Catholics get the idea of the cardinal and theological virtues? Well, we can appreciate the importance of the cardinal virtues just using our reason alone. Many philosophers throughout history have called attention to them. In addition, each of the cardinal and theological virtues I've just mentioned is praised by the Bible itself. Now, on the other hand, there are vices. A vice is basically the opposite of a virtue. In other words, it's a disposition to act poorly or sinfully. There are 7 deadly sins or vices that you may have heard of: pride, gluttony, that's Homer Simpson's, sloth, wrath, greed, envy, and lust. We'll be talking about lust more in just a bit.